Good afternoon and welcome to our 19th Franczek webinar since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. This week's panel is an Ask Anything format where we will address pressing questions that we've got from Illinois schools to prepare reopening one way or another. We're delighted to have you with us for the next hour, and thank you for joining us today and for submitting your questions during the registration process. And also, we want to remind you, you can submit questions during the webinar. If you look to the bottom of the bar, please use the Q&A function. That allows us to better monitor your questions and respond to them. Today, I'm joined by our panelists. First, we're pleased to have Mike Hernandez join us. I think this is your first appearance, Mike, on this particular webinar, but very, very happy to have you. Mike has to jump off at about 10 till, but we will get plenty expertise from Mike before then and take full advantage. We are also joined by our regular panelists, Nicki Bazer. Say hello, Nicki.
Hi, everyone.
And Fattore Crumley. Say hello, Dana.
Good afternoon, everybody.
So I want to highlight before we get started that we will continue next week, same time, same place, Thursday at noon, and continue our webinar series. So as always, if you find yourself looking for more information or we're not able to get to your question today, please reach out to one of us for information. If you've missed anything, you can find our webinars on our website. There's also alerts, blogs, podcasts, just a plethora of information there. So I direct you to our website. Okay, with that, let's jump in. So I'm going to start with a question we received from someone who has a full remote model. They ask, do you have any guidance on bringing some students back for services and the criteria that we might consider for that? Nicki, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Jen. And Jen, thanks for providing moderator services today. We know Jackie is very busy with all of the Title IX trainings, and just a reminder to school districts, Title IX, that deadline on the new regulations and your implementation is coming up. So please do reach out if we can be of assistance. But thanks, Jen, for filling in those shoes. So again, the question, if you have a full remote model, do you have any guidance on bringing some students back for services? You know, what is the criteria you should be using for this considerations? I mean, this is a really difficult question. I think overall, everybody's grappling with remote versus bringing students back. I believe this question is really geared towards sort of the special populations that ISB has highlighted. You know, students who are receiving special education services, EL services, students who may need more instructional support. And so should you be bringing those folks in for periods? You know, as with any in-person instruction right now, the criteria you're looking at is, first of all, can you do that safely and adhere to the public health guidance that we're getting both from ISB and IDPH at the state level, certainly the CDC at the federal level, but also your local public health officials at your local level who should be a source of information on this. And also, you know, looking at the community needs and your equity issues. So again, you know, combining, can you bring students back safely in a way that you can serve them? Are there students with sort of heightened needs in this time that makes sense for you to do that? And, you know, obviously checking base with your unions as well, because, you know, if there is students, obviously, if there's students that are coming back in person, that will require staff in person, and making sure that the parameters of that are discussed and any impact on the working conditions are discussed with your unions.
Okay, great. So Open Meetings Act, I think it was after our last webinar that there's a new executive order out. Mike, can you help us understand what the new executive order provides?
Sure. Well, what the new executive order gets read in conjunction with is Public Act 101-640. And the new executive order includes a gubernatorial disaster proclamation, which is one of the precursors for the boards to now hold virtual board meetings. So this act, among other things, amended the Illinois Open Meetings Act. It allows public bodies to hold virtual board meetings without a physical presence of a majority of a quorum of the board members. This can occur during the disaster declaration relating to public health concerns, and that's in fact what the governor's July 24th declaration included. And so here's what must be done to hold the meeting and how that occurs. You confirm the declaration, which we've done through this executive order. The head of the public body must determine that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent because of the disaster. And then you must provide 48 hours notice for the meeting unless there's a bona fide emergency. Now, we've seen really two ways that boards have approached this. You can have a member of the public body present at a location for the public to come participate in. You would have to satisfy all the mandates under the governor's executive order with respect to the number of persons allowed in a meeting. And then you can allow public participation at that time. However, as part of the declaration and as part of an assessment by the head of the public body or president or the superintendent, there can be a determination that that type of an in-public meeting is just not practical and is not consistent with the order. And so some boards have gone fully virtual in those cases. Now, if you go fully virtual, there are some checkoffs that we recommend that you look at, okay? And those include at the beginning of the meeting. At the beginning of the meeting, you should verify that, again, if you're gonna do it in person and you have someone there, one person there, you verify that at least one member of the public body, the chief legal officer or chief administrative officer is present at the regular meeting location unless that's not feasible. We talked about how that feasibility issue declaration is made. And what we are recommending is that declaration determination is included in the promulgation of the meeting notice 48 hours in advance. Verify that all members of the public body participating in the meeting can hear one another and all discussion wherever they may be. Verify that all members of the public physically present at the regular meeting location can hear all discussion and votes of the public body members unless attendance at the regular meeting location is not feasible due to the disaster. Public participation still must be part of it, and we may be talking a little about that later on as well. During the meeting, you must verify the following. Verify that all votes are conducted by roll call with identification and recording of the vote of each member of the public body. Prepare and maintain a verbatim record, audio or video recording of both open and closed portions of the meetings.
So, Nicki, do you have any additional experience with that? How's that playing out?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick thing. I think Mike was really thorough in how the requirements are to hold the remote meeting. And I know some districts are moving to the in-person meeting. Mike, I'm sure you've gotten these calls as well. One of the questions that I've been asked that keeps coming up is, because of the 50-person limit, how do we limit the in-person attendance at our meetings? You know, I think one of the things, there's a couple of options, I think. The first that I've advised is if you can hold a certain number in your main room with your board and do the social distancing, keep under 50, you know, go ahead and do that. If you get more folks, you may want to create an overflow room or overflow rooms. If you're able to then live stream the meeting into those overflow rooms, that would be one option. If that's just simply not an option, there, you know, some districts I know are going to sort of a first come, first serve. So if you get there and you're within the first, you know, say 30 people, and that's the space the district has, I think that's fine, as long as I would recommend, if those are the circumstances, that you make sure you're also live streaming. I think right now we're seeing this issue sort of come to a fore because a lot of folks are adopting, a lot of boards are adopting their reopening plans. And so people want to see them. And so we're definitely recommending live streaming those meetings and then making sure that there is capacity for folks in person. And if not, that they have that other option.
Okay. Oh, Dana, I think you're on mute there. Dana, you're still on mute. Yep.
Yeah, I've got it. So what about the reading of the public comments? Did we want to comment a little bit on that? Because we've had some questions about when a client is having, or a school district is having a in-person meeting and they do provide for social distancing. So maybe only 20 people got into the meeting, but then there are other people that are logged on by Zoom and they're submitting, you know, so many public comments. You know, to read all those public comments might take an hour, even 2 hours? How are we advising in those situations?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. So just a reminder, okay, the Illinois Open Meetings Act requires public participation at every meeting. And so certain reasonable rules for the process must be clear and in writing in the district's policy, such as time, place, and manner. The rule must be content neutral. And again, these rules are justified by significant governmental interest of having efficient business meetings. And so what do we do with respect to the written comments? The board rules should speak to that. If you have, let's assume there's a no disaster, regular open meeting, the board does not have to allow written email comments. They can have that in the rule, but that's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a different situation. So if it's virtual and you get a number of comments, the recommendation is indicate we've got a certain number of comments. Here's the general gist of what the comments are, especially when you're dealing with an issue that, are they supportive of this issue or are they not? Give them examples, let them know all the written comments will be made part of the record and that they will also be available for public review, and those will be subject to FOIA.
So switching gears a little here, if a family, this is a question about busing, if a family chooses not to ride a bus, let's say, per a district survey before the school year begins, can the district then deny access to the bus for entire year, for a trimester? Dana, what do you think about this?
So transportation is required for some students. It's required by the school code for people that live more than 1.5 miles away from the school districts, and is also required if there's a traffic or safety hazard on the path to school. And then of course it's required for some special education students as a related service. So I think the key to this question is, how have the parents opted out of transportation? You know, have you provided them with notice of their right to transportation? I mean, I think you have two different subsets of parents in most school districts. You have the subset of parents that's entitled per the rules that I just stated to receive transportation. And then you have a set of parents that maybe you offer transportation to because the bus is running by there anyways, and if they pay for it, they can get it. Or you're a school district that doesn't have to provide specialized transportation. Maybe you're using public transportation, but you run a bus, and you charge parents for it. So again, the key thing is you got to be giving parents notice of where they fit in that. Do they have a right to it? If they have a right to it and they choose to opt out, I think you can hold them to that as long as you give them notice that the reason we're doing this is to socially distance on the bus. Maybe you feel more comfortable driving your kid to school than taking the bus, and that's fine. So I do think that you can do this, but I do think your notice has to be adequate in the beginning to allow parents what their rights are and what the options are and why you're offering those options. I think the other thing that we've had the question about transportation is, can you reimburse parents? Like if parents are entitled to free transportation to school because they live 1.5 miles away, can you reimburse them for mileage? And I think the answer is you can. ISB though is saying they will not reimburse that. So I think that's an individual decision for a school district. If you think that's really going to help you and help your bus route become, really help you achieve a greater level of social distancing and be easier to manage, it might be something to consider, because again, we have local school districts. We're not like we're paying 50 miles of mileage for this. It would be a limited number of miles for each family.
And looking, Dana, I mean, I'm just thinking of, we do this in other contexts from time to time. So you mentioned right. IEP students who get specialized transportation. Sometimes there's situations where it is exorbitantly expensive to hire private transit, and the parent or a grandparent or someone is able to do it and then just get the mileage. It is so much less expensive to reimburse a grandparent for mileage than it is to hire a private taxi. So usually it's a good deal. Right.
And for some people, they're just going to feel more comfortable. And I think you're going to pave the way to fewer problems if you allow options that make families feel comfortable.
I guess I do want to mention, usually in those situations, we get a waiver and release because obviously car accidents happen. We certainly don't want to be drugging anything like that, but you know, this is an option.
There's a question about liability in the Q&A, and I'm happy to speak to that if you'd like me to.
Yeah, let me read that out. So as more districts decide to go with remote to start the year, can we address, Mike, could you address the liability issues? Will the state protect districts if when liabilities, or if when lawsuits are filed?
Yeah, and I would think that you might see more litigation if we go to full in-person instruction. But there has been discussion legislatively at the federal and the state level about that. But we also have the Tort Immunity Act here. And so there is expansive coverage under the Illinois Tort Immunity Act for our public workers, for our school district staff. What's important is to be following the guidance that you're getting and the best practices, and you'll fall within those protections.
Right, Nicki, do you have any more on that?
No, I think that's exactly right. And we talked about last time in terms of workers' comp and the rebuttable presumption that employees, if they get COVID, that they've gotten it at work. Again, exactly what Mike said, spot on. You know, if you're following the guidance, that's going to be a great way to demonstrate that, you know, to push back on that presumption. I just wanted to note that question came in from Tom Hernandez, who we are officially naming as a friend of the webinar, one of our most stalwart attendees. So we thank him for that question.
Great. And so another question we got during registration, we as a firm have talked about this particular topic almost endlessly. Close contact, Nicki. What is close contact when we're trying to figure out who needs to quarantine and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, this has definitely provoked a lot of heartache and discussion. We've all memorized the definition of close contact, which is less than 6 feet for 15 minutes or more. The question has arisen, though, are those minutes consecutive or cumulative? And originally, I think our thought was that they were consecutive. The idea is that if you have sort of prolonged exposure to someone, so you're standing in front of them less than 6 feet away for 15 or more minutes, this area does not seem to be addressed, you know, exactly on point in any of the public health guidance that we've seen thus far. However, we did ask this question of ISB, and they did send us a letter that indicates that they are interpreting it as 15 minutes over the course of the day. So cumulatively, not consecutively. I know Mike has been in communication with the Lake County health officials who are saying the same thing. So the conservative read right now is that it's cumulative, not consecutive. This is huge, right? I mean, it seems like such a small thing, but it's huge implications for schools that are opening in person. From the standpoint of who needs to isolate after there is a positive COVID. So if you have a staff member or a student in a classroom who is tested positive for COVID, and you are then deciding who to quarantine, this issue of whether the whole class has to go home, whether other teachers have to go home, you know, originally we were thinking it really is dependent on if they have that close contact for 15 minutes or more. Now you're really going to have to trace these minutes cumulatively. At this point, given sort of the guidance doesn't have a lot of clarity, there's a little bit of gray here. We're encouraging folks to talk to their local health officials about this. So, you know, if you're in Lake County, reach out to the Lake County, DuPage likewise, because it would be helpful to get interpretations at the local level as to what they're saying. But please do keep that in mind if you are thinking of reopening in person.
Great, and here's a question that we're getting kind of in two different forms. Now that we're having some blended where there's going to be some in person, we're getting questions about videotaping live instruction, either for kids who miss it, or maybe there's a cohort that's remote while some are in person, and then they switch and they want to live stream or then record for anyone who can't watch it live. Nicki, do you want to get us started? What are we advising on? Can they do this legally?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, you can record sessions. Certainly something you want to talk through with your unions before you do it. But you certainly can, and definitely makes sense to do so if you're trying to use those lessons for folks who are at home, folks who have missed it as part of your remote instruction as well. You know, when we talked about this last week, I mentioned, which is still the case, that the Department of Ed in a webinar that they hosted last spring, it's still on their website if folks want to check it out, they've indicated that, you know, the question came in, is this a student record? So do we have to maintain it? And their advice was, or their guidance was, that this is if it's about a student and it's being maintained by the district, it is a student record. And they raised the question that really these videos aren't being maintained by the district. They may be posted for a short time for students to access and then deleted. And so they were essentially suggesting that these could be considered to be not student records. Someone asked a great follow-up question last week that we weren't able to get to, which is, okay, but then are they subject to FOIA? So I think the answer to that is also a little unclear, but we would say, of course, they're subject to FOIA. Then the question is there an exception that might apply to withhold them? And I think that there are a couple of exceptions that do apply. So if they're not student records, obviously, if we decide that they are student records, we're going to maintain them, you know, for the next 5 years in the temporary record, then they're not releasable under FOIA under the exception for student records. If we don't believe that they're student records, then we could likely rely on the personal information exception as well as the instructional materials exception to FOIA. So if you are going to record and you get a request through FOIA, we would definitely recommend you reach out to us or to your legal counsel with that response. We would really encourage folks to think creatively about the exceptions because, you know, releasing sort of videos of classrooms, I think, with students in them is probably not what we want to be doing. This is an area also that I know we are recommending or thinking or with other folks about legislation, because I think clarity on this point would help districts quite a bit.
So we have a question that came in on the Q&A about asking about guidance that that districts should seek legal counsel and counsel from the health department about homebound services. And this is something I'm getting a lot of questions, and I know Dana is. Dana, what do you think about sending staff into a student's home for PTOT, speech, or other direct instruction?
So, I mean, I would say generally before this pandemic occurred, I was recommending that we almost never want to go into a student's home. So I know that there are very isolated cases where we do, but, you know, we should stick to that very limited exception in this particular area, and look for places that we can give homebound services other than in a person's home. For less disabled students, we often did it at libraries or at public spaces. For these more significantly disabled students, I personally would use the IEP process to avoid instruction at home at all costs. I do not think it is feasible, no matter what the Department of Health may say in terms of medical workers that go in the home, to send school workers into the home at this point. I think providing transportation and having the students come into a defined area of the school where no one else is traveling through, or it's not it's not near a thoroughfare where people are getting to an office or getting to another commonly used space. But I would not recommend that at this point. I don't think it's advisable anyways. I mean, I think that school is school. It's done in a professional, neutral setting, not in the living room. And there are other, especially now that we have all this technology, one of the benefits, I think, for homebound instruction, and Jennifer and I have talked about this, is we have such good technology now to bring teachers in through technological means. And we need to utilize those first.
Well, and I'm getting this question a lot around, let's say a student cannot wear a mask, genuinely cannot wear a mask for a medical reason. And the IEP team reviewed, and there's not other ways to keep the students safe. So there's no other accommodations that could keep the student and staff and everyone else safe in light of the fact they could not tolerate a mask. So they're homebound for that reason. To then send a staff member in the home does not solve that problem. There's still that same safety issue. So, if they're excluded from school because of a mask, we're not then going to send, it's not homebound, it's remote
Exactly.
instruction.
Exactly. And we can't put limits on any staff members and tell them, don't go to the grocery store. Don't be in the same room with your teenage children. That's not permissible legally or practically. So, I mean, I agree with you. I just think this is something that we have to look to technology now. And you need to use technology to address these types of instructional needs.
And I guess before we go on, I don't want to sound too heartless. I know that people are really struggling with, we know that there are some kids, some of the most severe kids who really, really need school. And unfortunately, I know you're in positions right now where you're going to have to say, no, it's not safe. And realistically, we know even, we're going to use technology, but that's not going to really be that great for that student. We know these are really, really hard, and you're making decisions that are terrible for some families, but in these situations where a student is medically fragile, we cannot follow health department requirements. There is just, I would not look at it as you making the decision. The decision's been made by the options that are available.
Right. And I always go back for school people and for special ed people, go back to the hierarchy of needs. Safety is the first need. And not to be too nitty gritty, but especially for these kids, really, these are students and families that cannot afford to be ill, not from a physical perspective, not from a financial perspective. If you have typically developing children and you get sick for a week, so they order takeout food. If you have a profoundly disabled child and you're sick for a week or 2 weeks, that is a significant burden emotionally, financially, in so many more ways. So I do think you need to be pretty, have these very robust discussions, raise these issues, and again, find ways to use technology, find ways to maybe do some parent training on how the parent can work with the student. But sending staff into the home to do this is just not safe for the student. And that's where your concern should start with.
So turning our attention a little bit, Cook County travel restrictions. So we've seen those. Mike, what are the implications for schools?
Sure. Well, let me just talk about the restrictions first, and that is that the headline blared 14-day quarantine recommended for persons entering suburban Cook County from states with high incidence of COVID-19 infections. And that's been expanded in Cook County, for suburban Cook County, to mirror Chicago's listing. We're talking about 22 states. This Friday, tomorrow, 4 states are being added: Wisconsin, North Dakota, Nebraska, and Missouri. And here's what the recommendation is from Cook County health officials. Any person entering suburban Cook County living in a high incidence state or who visited the high incidence state for more than 24 hours is recommended to self-quarantine for 14 days after arrival or for the duration of their stay in suburban Cook County, whichever is shorter. And so the implications for this for our employees are that when we do self-certifications, we're asking about travel. And, the districts need to consider now putting these states, 22 of them, on the listing of travel. And again, the recommendation is, again, for 14 days of quarantine. And I welcome any other thoughts from the team.
Mike, I just wanted to say that this has got to be, once Wisconsin entered that list, this is going to have a huge impact, right? Because, that's a typical, ride for folks to go up there.
Right. And I think as we're looking into going back to college season, which is a whole nother issue for teachers and school employees that might be taking their kids back to college, when you look at the other neighboring states, Missouri and Iowa are often destinations that people travel to take their college-age children back to school. We're going to have some quarantine issues there. We also got a question from before about international travel. And, there are some places that we are not accepting travelers from unless you are a U.S. citizen. And that's, I believe, China, Iran, and Italy still is on the list. But generally, if you're doing any sort of international travel, it's a 14-day quarantine requirement. As far as coming from our border countries, those borders are now, you can't drive over the border just for leisure or for travel. It's got to be essential business. But the quarantine, again, if you're going for essential business, you're not subject to that, but any other reason. So visiting family, you have students that travel to Mexico to visit family or travel out of the country to visit family, there is a quarantine of 14 days when they return.
So on the different topic of IEPs, we have a question about, can we provide specific guidance about when an IEP amendment will be needed? And this is a question that we're getting a lot. And there are so many variations out there of your reopening plans that there's a lot of different answers. So I would say, if you are providing something that is different than what's in the IEP, then you should look at amending it. Amending it to reflect a separate plan. If it's just going to be a phase and you're just doing, say, remote, but you want to preserve the in-person IEP as the core IEP, and it's just a remote learning plan, that's going to be an amendment if you didn't have one from the spring, or if it's blended and you're changing services. Now, if you're not changing services, so you have an IEP that just provides a resource class that they're still getting and some minutes of social work that they're still getting, you don't need to amend that IEP. I would also look at maybe goals and accommodations to a lesser degree, but if there's goals that you're not addressing, have no plans to address, and you're removing the services for those. So the amendments that I've seen sometimes change goals, change accommodations, or change service minutes. Mode does not need to change. So if you're actually doing the IEP, but doing it remotely, you don't need to change that IEP. That's fine. I don't know, Dana, if you've gotten any variations on that.
I do think that whatever you do, if you're changing, needs to be connected in the IEP to some way. I think sort of standalone things that are not connected to the IEP. I think when you make educational decisions about a student that's eligible for IDEA, it's got to have that stamp of the team on it, and to not connect these plans to the IEP, I think, is a problem.
It's just not that much more work either.
Right.
You know, I am hearing, and reasonable people can maybe disagree about this, but some are doing standalone plans for the remote or for the blended, but they're not doing it as an amendment form. They're just doing it as a standalone separate thing. We know that IDEA is not waived, and that in and of itself has changed the IEP services without, it's a procedural violation. You've changed it without going through the process. And the process isn't that much hard to just, if the parent's in agreement,
right,
you put that amendment form on it and you have complied with IDEA. So I guess without a lot more energy or effort, you get the full benefit of, you know, knowing that you haven't committed a procedural violation. So that's why we're recommending that you do it, not to, but, you know, we all live in reality too. We're understanding that sometimes, like, if you're telling me we have to amend all of our IEPs in 2 weeks, we can't. Well, you know, then triage and do it as you can. Do it over the course of the first quarter, or at least if you're holding annual reviews, you know, reflected in the notes what the difference is going to be during whatever the different phase is.
Right, and in the spring, we had a lot of people doing remote learning plans that were then presented electronically to parents, like, we're going to amend your IEP this way. Let us know if you agree. If you don't agree, we'll set a meeting. And the experience that I had, at least in the report back, is many people just said, great, and they went on their day, and it really wasn't any more burdensome. So something to consider from what we learned in the spring.
Yeah, and Jen, I was just wondering, you know, you mentioned that it's a procedural violation if you haven't gone through the amendment process, but wouldn't it also be a concern that you have essentially two documents then? I mean, unless you actually amend the IEP is sort of still in existence at that point, and arguably you're responsible for those services as well as whatever you've put in the remote learning plan, and that could be the subject of a later challenge from a parent, right?
Yeah, that's certainly a risk, and there's really no argument. No good. I mean, we'll argue emergency and the pandemic and different things, but we know that ID is not waived. We know the state regulations aren't waived. So, you know, as we have time and are able, have bandwidth, we should be aligning IEPs to whatever it is you're actually doing. So Nicki, I'm gonna change gears again, and FFRCA, I know this is your favorite law now.
It is. I talk about this law 24 hours a day, which is why I've actually been relegated to the basement right now because my family is just done. My 10-year-old can now talk about the FFCRA. So I know we've had a lot of questions.
FFRCA question at you. So under FFRCA, employees are entitled to ESL during quarantine. That's the preface to the question. Well, under quarantine, some employees are eligible and continue to work remotely and take paid leave. However, some employees are not eligible to work remotely. How do you explain, the question was, how do you explain fairness here? Non-eligible, it gets to use the ESL and get paid and not work, and then eligible has to forfeit the ESL by continuing to work. I'm not sure all the machinations there, but can you just, again, get us up to speed on FFRCA? What do we need to know and the impact of this ESL leave?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to remind folks, the FFCRA leave, there's two components to it. The first is the emergency sick leave, which is what Jennifer is referencing, which is for full-time employees, 80 hours. There are 6 prescribed reasons that you can take that for that relate to quarantine or caring for someone who's ill because of COVID or because a school or childcare has closed. There's also the Fmla, which is an expanded FMLA leave. And by expanded, I mean expanded insofar as the use of FMLA has been expanded to allow for use if you have a child whose place of childcare or school has closed. It doesn't expand your overall FMLA, but it allows you to use it for that purpose. It also, after the first 2 weeks, it is paid at 2/3 rate of pay. I think what this question is getting at is that there's going to be some situations, for example, where a teacher is quarantined and can continue to work remotely with their class over Zoom or however you guys are doing it, and would just get paid normal and would not be taking any FFCRA or any other benefit leave. And then there's going to be some employees who have to be quarantined and you don't have any telework for them. There's no way for them to work remotely, so they're going to have to take ESL or other benefit leave. You know, I think the balance of the FFCRA here is that the goal is to try to keep as much of the work of the district moving forward, right? We want to keep schools in session, you know, particularly the work that directly impacts students. So if we can keep our teachers teleworking, if they're able to, even while quarantined, you know, that is obviously what we want as an outcome. There are going to be just some of those jobs that you really can't do from home. And so that's why we have FFCRA. That's why the federal government has created this leave, to provide an option for employees to continue to get paid despite the pandemic and what we're in. I mean, if you think about it in terms of, you know, sometimes people use all their sick leave and sometimes they don't. Those are there. It's not, that's not a really a fair, I understand the fairness issue surrounding it, but really what we're doing is making that leave available in case someone needs to use it, in case the circumstances are such that they need to use it. So if you're able to telework, it's not that you're forfeiting that leave. You may have a circumstance where you're going to need it at some point. You yourself get sick and you simply can't telework. Again, the goal of the FFCRA, as with all your other benefit leave, is to make sure you have leave available if you need it. But hopefully we're going to be able to continue in some remote capacity so that the district can keep moving forward.
All right, and Dana, on the topic of student temperatures, we've gotten a lot of logistical questions, very concerned about I'll just sum it up as how is this all going to work? One question asked, they heard that maybe there was more guidance from the CDC that was in conflict with our state IDPH and ISB guidance, and just asked for clarification. So what is the guidance on self-certifications? Oh, you're on mute. Dana, you're on mute.
I've got it. Okay. So right now, the guidance that we're recommending is the IDPH guidance. And I understand that the self-certification logistically is extremely difficult. So, you know, as far as when do you do it, how do you do it? because the self-certification is so burdensome, we have some districts that are just choosing to certify and put a staff member on the bus and have the staff member screen the students before they arrive on the bus, and providing notice to parents that they have to be available until the student is boarded on the bus so that they can take the student back and bring the student home and either have the student have a sick day or access remote instruction for that day. As far as the self-certification, my understanding is that this is still permissible. There is a list of things that you need to check off, and that's for parents to do. Parents we need to have we're recommending that there be a record of that. ISB has said, you would want a record of this in case there is a question later. So it does become a student record that you would then have to retain. So we had people talking about stickers. I'm not sure that really is in line with what ISB is saying right now. So again, I don't know that I have any magic bullet for you. This is difficult. I think it's going to require extra staff. I think it's going to require record keeping that is, above and beyond. But this is what we have right now. I mean, Nicki, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is such a difficult question. One of the questions that ISB answered for us is, can kids who are under 18 self-certify? The answer to that is no. And so you have to, as you've been talking about, Dana, have to figure out a way to make sure that it's the parents that are certifying and not the students. And so, we've had some questions about, high school kids swiping in as sort of testament that they are self-certifying. Okay, well, but that's really the student self-certifying then, not the parent. And there needs to be a connection back to the parent. And I think that these are really complicated, questions. We've had some questions about electronic signatures or electronic check-ins. I think you can absolutely do that. A parent could do it through an electronic means, Skyward or the like. But I do think we have to somehow link it back to that parent certification rather than the student doing it themselves. If you don't have that proof, we've gotten that question, and I think at that point you need to have a staff member available to do a certification check for a student that doesn't come with one already completed.
So one thing that and we didn't talk about this before, so I just want people's thoughts on it. We have some districts that are saying, we'll have the parents self-certify as far as the symptom questions, but then we're going to take temperatures at school. And I know that I have a problem with that, just because I think you're going to end up with people saying, yes, they're okay to come. And then you're going to get them and they're going to have a temperature, and you're going to sort of create a problem for yourself parents have checked things. They feel like they're good to go. And then they go about their day, and then you get them at school and their temperature is a little bit high, and where do you put them? So even though it's burdensome, and I think the temperature, having a nurse or a school employee takes the temperature gives a measure of comfort, the feasibility of it, I have questions, I guess, or concerns that it's just going to create. What does anybody think?
Yeah, I mean, we had the same question, or the same logistical question last week about if you have someone take the temperature for the school bus, but you didn't require, like you were saying, a parent to stay available until what are you going to do with that information? You need to have information that's usable and actionable. And so you're, like you said, you're setting yourself up for, okay, now you have a room full of kids with temperatures, as opposed to ideally parents would be honest about taking temperatures and keeping kids home. That's obviously the best situation logistically.
Yeah, I think whatever you do, the rules need to be clear, and they need to be equitably applied all to everyone, as opposed to selectively identifying, certain groups of students and things like that.
Right.
Yeah, everyone needs to understand the system that you're using.
Hey, Jen, I just wanted to circle back because we've gotten a couple of other FFCRA questions in, and I just wanted to clarify. We had a question about after the 10 days, if someone's taking the EFMLA at 2/3 pay, are they using their own leave time to pay for that? No, the 10 weeks of EFMLA are paid at 2/3 rate. They don't have to take their own benefit time simultaneously. I think there was also a question in the chat about the use of FFCRA. There's a lot of FFCRA questions and they all have just sort of a lot of different permutations. I did want to just reference again that we do have a leave and accommodation guide. If anybody is looking for that, happy to, if they reach out to me or anybody on the webinar, it takes you really through all of the FFCRA permutations and, you know, sort of it's like a choose your own adventure. You know, if you have this, what happens, but talks through all the eligibility and the different pay rates. So that may be useful because there's just a lot, we could spend we may actually spend an entire webinar at some point on FFCRA questions, but they are coming in. So again, just wanted to highlight that answer, but you know, encourage folks to seek out that guidance.
Yeah, so another question around work is, we've heard some plans where they're going to go full remote as far as instruction, but require teachers to come into the classroom. I just talked to a district about this the other day. Nicki or Dana, could you get us started? What are the implications of requiring teachers to teach from the building, but again, it's going to be remote for the students?
Yeah, I'm happy to get us started, Dana, and then you know, maybe you can jump in at some point as well. I think, you know, there are some districts that are planning to do this. I think their goal and hope is that it creates a space for teachers to come and to provide, you know, consistent and robust instruction, you know, rather than having folks working from home. And certainly that is, you certainly can do that. A district does, you know, has the authority to say they want their teachers in the building to do the remote learning. You know, obviously the flip side or the downside could be from a personnel perspective, we already are seeing huge amounts of requests coming in for accommodation. And so to the extent that, you know, providing an opportunity for teachers to teach remotely alleviates some of those needs, you know, you will have to navigate that a little bit differently. One of the other interesting implications that has come in recently and questions that have been raised is, if you have a teacher in a school building who is alone in their classroom teaching to their computer screen, do they have to wear a mask? The reason this question has come in, which is a great question, is that according to the ISB guidance, the answer to that would be yes. However, we have had some districts reach out individually to ISB folks, and they've gotten the answer that no, if a teacher is alone in the classroom, they don't have to wear the mask during that session. You know, hopefully ISB will produce something in writing on this, because I think that is a source of confusion. And Dana, I know we were talking this morning about what if you say you don't have to wear a mask, but a teacher wants to wear a mask even if they're on camera with students? Thoughts on that?
I do think that if people want to wear a mask, you have to treat that as a request for an accommodation under the ADA. And you would have to go through that process before saying no. You know, I also think of, you know, just sort of the, you know, to make sure that if you're having them teach without a mask, that you're also, and if people are comfortable doing it, also saying that, like, the reason I'm doing this, you know, having a disclaimer, the reason I'm doing this is because I'm socially distanced. Because if you are at some point going to have kids back in the school, this mask requirement is not going to go away. I think the research is there to support it. And so you don't want to set yourself up for a situation where people are coming to school without masks because they've been watching a teacher on a Zoom without masks in the school building. So I think you do need to address that in some way, and make sure that you are, for teachers that want to wear masks, treating that as a request for an ADA accommodation.
You know, we've had some impact bargaining on this issue of staff returning. And what we found is a lot of the questions that staff had raised were reasonable questions. And so we actually have been talking to the unions about some sort of training on the protocols, which is being done for office workers returning. And so it answers a lot of questions. They get a better sense of safety, and they understand what their obligations are as well.
And Mike, I'm hoping, I know you only have 1 minute left or so, but could you give us an update on the IHSA before you go? Sports. What's going to happen with sports this year?
So yesterday, the IHSA Board of Directors voted to postpone the contact sports, field hockey, football, soccer, and volleyball that were scheduled to take place this fall. in coordination with that, the governor had issued guidelines for youth and adult recreational sports. So the season for these contact sports will be scheduled to the spring, rescheduled to the spring. They also voted to allow golf, swimming, diving, and tennis to take place as scheduled with an August 10th start date. Cross country will also be allowed to start with certain modifications on August 10th. And then this has not been approved by the Illinois Department of Public Health, but since it's consistent with the governor's announcement on Wednesday with respect to fall sports, they think that this will be approved. And as part of that, the fall sports will begin with competition limited to conference opponents and other schools in the same general geographical area.
Okay, that was big news yesterday, and I know it's very important. Nicki,
I was just going to say that I played varsity field hockey in high school and was not aware it was a contact sport, which may have been why we lost so many times. So clearly not playing it correctly. So, but glad that the IHSA is looking out, trying to come up with a safe plan for the fall. I know this is hard stuff for everyone, and everybody wants to see these activities take place. So
thanks again for the opportunity, team. See you next
Thanks,
time.
Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
for being with us. We'll see you later.
Bye-bye.
well, Dana and Nicki are going to hang for just a few more questions here. Nicki, we've gotten a lot of questions about this. You have a large area, and can you partition off large areas to allow more than 50 kids in, say, cafeteria or field house?
Yeah, this was just a fairly recent change from ISB. So if you are following with bated breath the ISB Q&A responses and updates, they did provide some guidance on this, which is great, because I know there are a lot of particularly high school districts that have big field houses and they want to use those spaces effectively. So what they said was that large spaces can be partitioned with fire code approved floor to ceiling dividers to create different additional rooms, each with a capacity of 50 people. So again, like if you have a large gymnasium or a large arena and you have those kinds of partitions, that come down that are fire code approved, floor to ceiling, then you can use those as individual spaces, and then the 50 limit is for those individual spaces.
Okay. And Dana, paras. How can districts use paras to facilitate in-person and remote instruction legally?
Okay, so paras can be used to supervise students at any time when there's no instructional activities taking place. So study halls, lunchrooms, playgrounds, when kids are arriving, when kids are leaving and they're gathering, those are all just during regular school time, those are all permissible places for paras to supervise students. The issue is when you're having a para alone with students and you're supposed to be having instructional time. So we had one specific question that I will sort of raise where someone asked if the teacher if you have kids divided into an A group and a B group, so you're teaching 5th grade and you've got 12 5th graders one day and then your other 12 5th graders are logging on through Zoom or through Google at home, can the teacher take 10 minutes, check in just personally with the online people and have a para-professional supervise the class? And I think that's fine, again, as long as it's not counted as instructional minutes. You can't leave a class alone with a paraprofessional if that's part of your instructional minutes. If it's not, if it's just time where they're, having time to do some work or they're doing independent stuff, I think that's okay. But if it's supposed to be instructional, the teacher should be in there. And, I think you also need to consider is like practically, teachers can go to the corner, they can still be physically present in the room and check in with they're gonna have to do that probably anyways, because that's the method that you're using, you're gonna have people raising their hand on Zoom, arguably, in the same way you're gonna have people raising their hand sitting right in front of you. So the teacher is going to have to get acclimated to sort of looking at both places to address questions if you're going to need to do synchronous instruction. And in that way, you can use the aid, having the aid in there because I know people are thinking, what are we going to do with aids? Should we do riffs? But I think you'll have a more robust product, especially for the kids that are younger and do have sort of a lot of, this type of question all the time. If you have an aide in there sort of watching that, as we often do, Jennifer right now is watching for your questions so Nicki and I can answer them. So same principle.
So we're getting questions, quite a few questions about quarantining. Let me throw this one at you, Nicki. Does a staff member have to quarantine for 14 days if they have come in close contact for more than 15 minutes unmasked with someone that may be exhibiting COVID symptoms? No tests have been performed.
Right. So first, I just want to make clear that the close contact is masked or unmasked. So it does not matter if the person was wearing a mask; it's still considered close contact. This is sort of an area of considerable confusion. There's a lot of questions about isolation and return. The IDPH guidance is that if someone comes into close contact with someone who's experiencing COVID, then they should quarantine for 14 days. Even if you don't have a confirmed case, I think the guidance is generally that that if the person either has tested positive for COVID or is exhibiting symptoms of COVID, and I know that there's a little bit confusion around this, so I would continue to keep an eye on public health guidance on that point. Again, I think that this is an area of a lot of confusion. I know we have a lot of questions about what happens if someone comes in close contact. And again, this is one of those reasons why you do want to make sure that you are aware of sort of the social distancing and who you're going to need to quarantine in your school building if someone tests positive for COVID.
And I also think the thing to keep in mind, and this is not going to be the answer anyone wants to hear, so you can all talk about me behind my back when we sign off, is that some of these questions, you're just going to have to ask more questions before we can have an answer to them. So someone has a symptom of COVID-19. So I was in line for an ice cream cone, and it was a super long line, and somebody was coughing in front of me. Do I need to quarantine? Well, we don't know that person, and they could be coughing for a myriad of reasons, and we would hope that if that was the case, people would sort of give some extra space and not be within 6 feet and be wearing their mask. But that's different than I was with my brother-in-law outside, and he's called me to tell me he feels ill and he's going to get a COVID test in a day. In that case, that's a different situation. So I think you are going to have to use, I think that's why you have the guidance document that says what the rules are, and then you take those specific situations and you ask the questions you need to make the guidance document work in the best way it can. And then if you have questions, you get another opinion, and that can be from your legal counsel. It can be from another person in HR. We need to work together on this. I wish there was some bright line rule, but for a lot of it, there's just not one yet.
Yeah, we did get one question in the Q&A about what if you have a child with just a symptom of COVID who stays home or is sent home? What are the circumstances under which the child can come back to school? Must they be given a COVID test at the beginning or have a test in order to come back? There's no, the guidance is that if someone is experiencing symptoms, that they do need to self-isolate. And the self-isolation is, it's 10 days of self-isolation and at least 24 hours since a fever without fever-reducing medicine or symptoms. Or you can get 2 negative tests that are administered 24 hours apart. I mean, the test-based strategy is likely impractical for most folks, because just getting 2 tests and getting the results back, you're going to be at the 10-day mark likely anyway. I understand that there's this confusion about is it just symptoms or is an actual confirmed case of COVID? But ISBE's guidance suggests that it is symptoms. And I think we've seen a little bit of a different guidance from some of the public health officials. So this is actually something where you really do need to touch base with your local public health guidance, because I think some of the local health guidance is a little bit more conservative. And some have been a little bit clearer about this. We also have protocols on this if folks want. I think it's really hard to sort of do this through a webinar because all of these circumstances, as Dana indicated, are so different. So I would suggest taking a look at our protocols or having us look at your protocols And these are all things that should be done in discussion with your public health officials.
Great. Well, thank you both. Want to remind everyone we will be back next week, so look for an alert about that. And thanks for joining us again for the 19th webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.